Good morning. Welcome to strategy session number 1, Diversity and Pluralism, the Future of American Education, with a question mark. My name's Marty West. I'm an associate professor of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the editor of Education Next, a journal of opinion and research on education policy that I hope is a useful resource for many of you in the field. And it's an honor to have a chance to participate in this year's summit. For more than a century, the words public education in America have evoked a specific set of institutional arrangements: neighborhood schools, funded by the government and managed by locally elected boards. That understanding has been so pervasive that many of us still have a hard time envisioning anything else. But that understanding of public education is far from universal. It's the exception rather than the rule. In many democracies, public education is delivered in ways that favor parent-driven diversity over standardization, that favor pluralism over uniformity. And even here in the US, the past 3 decades have seen a wide range of efforts to break down local geographic monopolies and open up the provision of public education, publicly funded education, to alternative institutions, to nonprofit charter operators, and even to religious organizations running schools accepting voucher students. We now have a cheerleader for those types of programs in the White House and at the Education Department. And so it raises questions. Is the continuation or even the acceleration of this trend the future of American education? Should it be? Do we want it to be? Do we want it to be only under certain conditions, that is, policies that ensure that diversity leads to higher levels of performance and avoids social fragmentation? And if we do want pluralism to be the future of American education, what are the political and practical barriers to making it so? And how might they be overcome? That's our agenda for the next hour or so, and I'm delighted to have really an ideal set of panelists to address those questions with me. I'll introduce them. You have more extensive bios in the app for the summit, but I'll give you a few highlights to illustrate why I'm so excited to have this conversation with these 4 individuals in particular. First, immediately on my right, Ashley Rogers-Berner is Deputy Director of the Institute for Education Policy at Johns Hopkins University, where she's also an assistant professor of education. Importantly for our purposes today, she's the author of the book, Pluralism in American Public Education, No One Way to School, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2017. Darrell Bradford is the Executive Director of NYCAN and Executive Vice President of its national parent organization, 50CAN. What that means is he plays an absolutely critical role in advocating for education reform across the nation. He's been had a variety of roles in that space, a longtime advocate for education reform. He's also the best-dressed member of the panel, at least, and I would say the entire sector. John Katzman is a serial education entrepreneur who has founded, to my knowledge, at least 3 prominent education companies: the Princeton Review, 2U, which works with universities to create high-quality online degree programs, and his latest and current venture, Noodle Companies, which creates companies that seek to bring radical transparency and market-driven change to our education system. As someone who's had 2 employers, both of which are older than our country, I look at John's resume and I don't know exactly how I would handle that environment. But I look forward to learning from him today. And finally, Andy Smerick is the Morgridge Fellow in Education at the American Enterprise Institute, where he writes prolifically on a wide range of policies, issues in wide range of issues in domestic policy. Prior to his role at AEI, he's held a wide range of positions in both state and federal government, including as a White House Fellow on the Domestic Policy Council, as Deputy Commissioner of Education in the state of New Jersey, and as a Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Education. He also serves currently as the President of the Maryland State Board of Education. I think what we'll find is that all of the panelists are sympathetic to the concept of pluralism in education. They favor a future in which American education looks more plural than it is now. But I also think we'll quickly see that there's a lot of important disagreement on exactly what that more plural system should look like. And so my hope is that we can quickly move to tackling some very concrete questions about how policy should be designed in order to make the most of the opportunity that pluralism in education could provide. So with that as an introduction, let me dive into the panel itself. I should say that we'll spend about 40 minutes or so talking amongst ourselves and then quickly turn to you to add to the conversation as well. So Ashley, let me start with you. And let me start out with the basics by asking, what is educational pluralism? How does it differ both from the status quo and from maybe the libertarian ideal of a complete free market in education? And I realize that there's a danger in asking such a broad question to someone who literally just wrote a book on the topic. So let me ask you to be relatively succinct, but get us started with a definition. What is pluralism?
Thank you, Marty, and thank you for hosting this event to the foundation. So educational pluralism, very simply, is a different way of organizing public education, such that the government funds and regulates, but does not necessarily deliver education. The government funds and regulates, but doesn't necessarily deliver education. This, in fact, is the norm among democratic countries, for which the default is a multitude of options for parents, all of which are held to the same standard by the state. So for example, in Alberta, Canada, you could attend an Inuit school, a Jewish school, a Catholic school, or even homeschoolers are granted a stipend. They all have to follow the same curriculum, but it's delivered with the materials and in the framework that fits their distinctive ethos. The same is true in Singapore, the same is true in Finland, the same is true in France and the UK and Australia and Sweden. Many of these countries are actually moving in the pluralist direction.
Now, John, you've been writing about these topics some recently, and one of the things I noticed is that in contrast to a lot of the literature on, I guess, market policies in education, charter schooling, and vouchers, a lot of the case for those policies is often made on the grounds of competition, that we need to introduce competition in order to put pressure on traditional public schools to improve. But you sort of place more emphasis on the concept of fit. What do you mean by fit in education, and how does it fit into this topic?
Well, first, I think there is a competitive impact that is interesting. I'm on the board of NAPCS, and we're just finishing up a study that I think in a pretty conclusive way shows that the higher the concentration of charters, the better the performance of the district, the more the district improves over time in that city. And I think that's going to be an important study. So I'm not denying.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to suggest that you were dismissive of that. Yeah.
But in terms of fit, the notion that one size fits all, that every student should learn the same thing at the same time is clearly ludicrous. And the notion that every school has to be right for every student is similarly, intuitively, obviously wrong. So what wealthier parents do is they agonize over very subtle distinctions between really good independent schools in their cities. And that notion is something we should be working hard to talk about and hard to enable for every parent, that we should stop seeing it as which school is better and start talking about it as which school is better for your kid.
I think I start to hear there the, seeds of a potential disagreement in the sense that Ashley emphasized that her notion of pluralism really does involve schools that are operating under the same set of standards, even in some cases curricular frameworks, whereas I think you're suggesting that that might constrain the amount of variation, the potential we can get from increasing opportunities for fit.
It's an area of disagreement.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. Darrell, So, one of the concerns that are often raised about policies like charters and vouchers, about markets in general, is that they will aggravate rather than improve problems of equity. You've argued fairly forcefully against that position, but I'd like you to help us understand, why do you not think that pluralism is in tension with the pursuit of equity? After all, we know that in American policy, when people are getting different things, oftentimes that means that, I guess, historically disadvantaged communities are getting something worse.
So I'd like to thank the host for making the mistake of inviting me back again. I'd also like to thank you for having the screen up here so Andy doesn't have to suffer the psychic damage of having his sock game upended.
No. My sock game crushes your sock game.
So two like small, like, again, variations on this before I answer your question. I just think this, or maybe it's just one. The definition of competition, I've just, over time, I think it's the wrong value for what we actually seek. So I think we know competition works. I'm skeptical of whether or not we should be judging positive solutions based on whether or not the second boat rides faster. So I just want to throw that out there. I do think that the world is better when people are empowered to choose, and that is the value that competition evinces, and I'd like to see us kind of like focus how we think and how we talk about policies that actually put people in control and put, institutions in opposition to one another in a way to get positive outcomes differently. On the other thing, though, is that I would just say, so I don't think a pluralistic system is less equitable than the system we have now, because the system we have now isn't equitable. I mean, it is inherently organized in a way to sort of drive huge gaps around wealth, race, power, and influence. You wouldn't build a system that assigned people to school based on the housing market and housing prices if you wanted an equitable system, right? You're just saying that you have a different set of values that supersede whether or not you think everybody should have choice or everybody should have a great opportunity at school. So I hate to be like the pessimist about it, but it can't get no worse. And so if we already actually have the worst thing, which is possible, right, then we should at a minimum be trying something that is diverse, different, or that challenges the current order to try to get a better thing.
Andy, you've been writing from a conservative perspective on issues of education reform and trying to take conservative values very seriously. And you've noted, I think, in a persuasive way that there's a tension between some conservative values like respect for tradition, a recognition of the possibility of unintended consequences when you make sudden and dramatic changes to institutional structures, and advocating for blowing up traditional public schooling in the U.S. as we know it and as we've known it for more than a century. How should conservative reformers at least reconcile that potential tension?
Well, I don't know how reconcilable it is, but if it is, it has to begin with just this recognition. And it took me a while to get to this point and be able to say it out loud. And I think any conservative who deals in any policy domain, if the following facts are true, you're in trouble. One, you're a conservative and you believe in longstanding institutions and evolutionary change and incremental gains, and the longstanding institutions are not doing the stuff that you want. Well, that's often how a lot of us gung-ho reformers have felt on the conservative side. That is, I do believe that there is, when a longstanding institution like America's system of public education, it goes on for a long time and lots of people like it, it is evolutionarily robust. That a lot of people on the left might say, well, something that is there for a long time often is just like an accretion of mistakes. A conservative would often say, no, that's actually proof of how good it is, that it is amplifying our strengths and mitigating our weaknesses. It's been time-tested, it's valuable. And conservatives like to think in terms of, oh, well, there's wisdom there. But at the same time, if we look at this institution and say it does not support other conservative values that we hold dear, pluralism, personal agency, efficacy of a bunch of different families who look different from one another, being able to choose what school you go to. A question we got to wrestle with is, well, which do we prioritize? Dramatically changing this thing based on these other conservative principles we hold, or the recognition is there might be a whole lot of wisdom in what we currently have that we're not appreciating right now. And this is a daily struggle for those of us, especially who do public policy.
So Ashley, how did we get the system that we have right now? I think you highlight some key historical moments in the 19th and early 20th century that might shed some light on Andy's, question of, are there good reasons for doing things the way we do them now? Or are there clear mistakes? Help us understand that.
Sure. So in my view, the mistakes are significant and pervasive and have had a very important effect on our imaginations about what public school is in the first place. So historically, the United States used to support a variety of schools. Our towns and cities used to support Jewish schools, Catholic schools, Protestant schools, or a non-sectarian Christian religious school where the population was sparse. And in fact, as the industrial revolutions occurred and the vote expanded, most democracies funded education in this way. 1833, when J.A. Roebuck made a speech in Parliament arguing for public funding for education, he rested his case on the expanding franchise and the need to equalize opportunity. So what happened in our case is that a pluralistic system became a uniform system because of the argument that the hordes of immigrants who came to this country, who were predominantly Catholic, could not become good citizens. So it's hard to think back what it must have been like for the Protestant majority, which in a lot of the large towns in the United States were at risk of losing their political capital, and here these Catholic immigrants who had, after all, the authority of the Pope behind them, had different ways and so forth. The nativist movement was very powerful, took over many of the state legislatures in the mid-19th century, and actually grabbed hold of Horace Mann's notion of the common school and pulled it into the legislation. And so we have a uniform system as a default, as our cultural backdrop for those historical reasons. And yes, I do think it was a mistake, because it's ironic when we look at educational research, we find that Catholic high schools in particular have had an independent positive effect not only on closing the achievement gap, but on civic behavior. So that's probably enough on that.
Can I add one thing to that? So I think we have to, those of us who believe in pluralism have to recognize that there are lots of other folks who don't see pluralism as a virtue at all, or a minor one when it comes to public education, because pluralism can be read by people as a stalking horse for inequality, lack of access. It's just a nice diplomatic way of saying we're going to allow different people to do different things, meaning the rich continue to be rich, and certain groups get to discriminate against one another. And so the way that I like to think about this is, our old motto, e pluribus unum. How much do we value this pluribus part, and how much do we value the unum? And there are lots of people in public education who actually think that the unum, like from many one, the one is the important thing. Our public education is meant to bring everyone together, these are my words, to homogenize PS1, PS2, PS3, to make sure all kids have access to the exact same things, so we can get rid of all of the nasty differences between them so kids have equal opportunity. So a question that I struggle with on this score is, how do we get from pluribus to unum? So there's one mindset, it's our traditional mindset, which is you have a singular monopolistic system that brings everyone together, it's a single democratically elected board, kids are assigned to school based on their home address. You take America's differences and you make us one by forcing us into the system. There's this other view that isn't totally popular, but one I'm much more attuned to, which is like what economists might call spontaneous order or emergent order. You have different people, you respect our pluribus, our differences, and you allow them to make these decisions on their own. Create schools that fit their setting. Create schools, replicate schools that are working for they and their communities. And so then what comes out of that is an unum based on people developing mediating institutions, voluntary associations that come together, and our unity then is actually a patchwork quilt of people being different. Those are two very different views of the world, and I think we got to reconcile. We have to recognize that.
Yeah.
Both Darrell and John want to respond. Let's
Yeah,
get Darrell in first.
I just want to say, I want to throw it out there and not answer it. I do think sort of pregnant in this whole discussion is the question of sameness versus equality, like sameness and fairness, and they're not the same thing, right? And like part of the tension here is whether or not we want to give people, you know, an equal chance at something where the outcome might be different, or the same chance at something, and even if the same thing is terrible, and that lives in all this. I just want to say, like, if what you wanted is e pluribus unum, like, you would not organize the current system, right? I think we have e pluribus dividus, because we are as divided as we've ever been. And as much as, and Governor Bush talked about it this morning, as much as we've actually like improved the number of the universe of children who have access to non-district run monopolistic choices over the last 10 years, the vast majority of kids like are going to the de facto system whose primary job is supposed to be to impart the shared civic values that make our democracy go. And this is a massive failure. I'm sorry, I gotta tell you, like, you read the newspaper, you watch the TV, the one sole thing that is the reason why we gotta have public schools is not happening. It's not happening. So I do think, again, with all of these discussions and trying to figure out the way forward, it is deeply important that we recognize that the world that we actually live in, not the world that we want to live in, and which is to say the way our institutions actually perform, not the way they should perform, because they're, like, in many cases the gap is so profound that it is not worth starting at what we think it should do as the default rationale.
And just to emphasize that point a bit, Ashley's book discusses a lot of evidence that actually private schools have an advantage when it comes to imparting civic values,
yeah,
including political tolerance, in ways that surprise at least some observers. John?
So here's what's hard. Flexibility makes measurement harder. That's right. And if you look at sort of what we're wrestling with at a core level, think about the metrics that you can get today. You can look at absenteeism, you can look at test scores, you can look at survey data. And none of them are persuasive to anybody. Like, we spend billions of dollars measuring our schools and our teachers and everything. When I go to a head of accountability in a state and I say, so, you know, here's a stack of data, where do I send my kid? I get a blank stare. Like, nobody can use this data to actually make any decision, to do anything. It is not persuasive and not useful. On the other hand, you look at the things that actually everyone in the country agrees with. What are really the goals of schools? Well, over the next 30 or 40 years, our kids are going to be employed, they're going to like their employment and be engaged in it, they're going to be agile enough to move as the economy changes, they're going to be happy and healthy, they're going to be low obesity, low alcoholism, low suicide rates. They're going to be good members of society. They're going to vote. They're not going to go to prison, right? There are measurable things, but the problem, it's almost a Hubble telescope problem. When we finally get that data, it's measuring our schools from 20 years ago. Right? It's not measuring the schools today. And so the persuasive, important data is out there. The useless but obtainable data today is what we're relying on. We expect that there's a correlation between the two, but we don't measure that correlation. We just take it on faith. And the level of sophistication you need in a big data world to be looking at the long-term data that counts, to be looking at the short-term data, and continuing to evolve our understanding of what's working for which kids is a tremendous amount of work and discipline that we've been so far unwilling to do. And when we talk about pluralism is a major limiting factor to our ability to drive change.
Just to continue it a little bit before I let Darrell get in. I mean, so one potential response to that is, all right, well, we don't have information to inform people's choice to harness the potential of pluralism to drive improvement, whether via competition or fit. So we better stay away from that approach. But that's not, I think, where you take the conversation.
It's not. We can start now collecting data in a more rigorous way and thinking through measurement systems that are meaningful, that don't require a one-size-fits-all approach, either in curriculum or in delivery. And that's, again, that could be a conversation, but pluralism is pluralism. And even as we are implementing more sophisticated data systems, continue to create a kind of thoughtful, experimental mindset that, and meanwhile focusing parents on the real issue, which is, what is the best answer for your kid? That's where everything starts.
I just want to, first of all, thank Andy for his time in 2 state agencies suffering over these questions, because I would kill myself if I had to work in a state agency and think about this stuff. But I do think, but beneath all of this is this question of, well, there's 2 questions. There's one is like, what assurances can we give the public that that things aren't going crazy, right? Like what is not the minimum in a way that is just like libertarian Eden, which is what you referred to it as earlier, but like something that is like minimally consistent, but that gives us some guardrails about a more diverse world. I think that's an important, difficult question to answer. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, and it really to John's questions about what we should measure and how we can sort of build the platform on which people can take more risk and try new things and bring better or different opportunities into the world. It's just that it's just the difference between like what is qualitative and what is quantitative. And I feel like as a movement over the last 10 years, we spent a lot of time focusing on things that were quantitative. They weren't multivariate, but they were tangible, and they helped us make a lot of change, right? Like, I believe in test scores. I think if you're a black kid in Central Brooklyn, test scores matter, because like when somebody outside of there sees that you aced the SAT, they understand that you weren't grade inflated into like #1 in your class. Like that matters, right? In ways that are significant. At the same time, like there are lots of people who just, I mean, they care less about that than they care about things that are personally not important to me, but that are really important to them, like happiness. You know, or like, does my kid smile at night? Do they give me a hard time, right? I mean, it sounds pejorative, but like there are just lots of other variables that people use to measure schools that are not ones we're sort of traditionally organizing the policy process around. And if you want to get to a place where like people can bring better things, or like more civic engagement can happen in the creation of schooling, you got to have like this multiple vision of what is good that currently, I think, that eludes the current framework by which we measure what is good.
It raises the question of who's going to engage in that work of developing new measurement systems and things like that, but we can come back to that. Ashley.
So first I want to acknowledge that it is a fact, I think, that pluralism can, if it depends on how these programs are implemented, pluralism can certainly lead to greater inequity. It can lead to greater equity as well. It depends on how we structure it. So for example, when Chile decided to pluralize its system, it did not means test its vouchers. And so middle class took advantage of it, upper middle class took advantage of it, and it entrenched the economic disparities that existed. So there are ways to structure legislation in ways that work towards equity and ways that work against it. And we fortunately know quite a bit about this. I think the one thing I will say to the point about citizenship and the civic republicanism that Andy mentioned, which is very strong in this country, that we need to shed our particularities to engage in the public square. We shed our religious beliefs or our secular beliefs, and that's what the common school is all about. I disagree with that approach, but I think we have to acknowledge that part of what public education is meant to do is to create good citizens and to champion the common good. And that's why the libertarian vision, I think, falls flat. Because while we can empower individual parents, education, public education is not merely a private good. So to John's point, there are different ways to structure that common conversation that our founders wanted to happen. The most common way that democracies do this is by having a common curriculum. It may be not a specified curriculum, but curricular frameworks. You must know why the revolution happened and what went wrong, what went well. You must know something about the ancient world and so forth. And that can be delivered in many different ways. It can be personalized and deepened for students who want more information, but there is a baseline of academic content that enables us to have a common conversation.
Can I say something about the policy side of accountability? If you think about a continuum of like how we could do this, there are three pretty bold like places that are clear that you can understand. I want to argue that we need more action between two of the three. So on one far end of the spectrum, you can think of accountability, the traditional system, pre-chartering, pre-choice. You have a district that owns and operates all public schools in a geographic area. There's really not all that much accountability. They decide, professionals decide what a good school looks like. They assign kids to school based on home address, end of story. That's sort of like 1900 to 1990. Second phase is this first steps towards pluralism, where to Marty's point and Ashley at the beginning, as you start to say the government can shift from being a sole school operator, and this is now the language of reinventing government, to no longer rowing but steering. The government isn't going to operate schools, it's going to oversee schools run by others. So you start to get pluralism. But the second phase was we're going to have performance contracts thanks to authorizers. But because of NCLB and some other things, those performance contracts tended to be very, 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 very similar. All of the high-stakes decisions were mostly based on graduation rates, reading, and math scores. So technically there was diversity among schools, diversity among providers, but how they were held accountable was very narrow, how we define success. On the far end of the spectrum is a full choice model where you simply say the government's role in this is really to fund schools, to fund individuals so they can choose schools of their own. There is no public accountability. Really what there needs to be is private accountability. Give money to families, they decide which schools they go to. Schools that succeed will grow, schools that are bad will go away. A lot of people feel uncomfortable for Ashley's reasons, and many of ours probably, that sort of leaves the public out of public education. I think the most exciting, most important space is between 2 and 3. How do we get the public still in the accountability, but getting away from the homogenized performance contracts that are just about reading, math, graduation scores? And some places are doing this. Certainly, DC has tried it, NACS has been thinking about it. It's differentiated performance contracts that allow schools to be different, but still somehow allow the public to weigh in on what a successful school looks like. I think the next 10 years of pluralism, school choice has to focus on this. How do we allow different people to define school success differently, but in a way that we all can appreciate?
Suggests maybe a mistake was made along the way in requiring all charter schools to participate in state testing systems, which was actually not the case initially, but some states had made different decisions in that area, but No Child Left Behind sort of required all states to take that same approach.
Historically, this is a really interesting point that, remember, the charter movement got started in 91, 92, NCLB came along in 2001, 2002. For that first 10 years, the charter movement had the opportunity to create widely different performance contracts for their schools. But once NCLB said public schools are public schools, they need to be held accountable similarly, that started to mean that charter schools as public schools needed to be put into the exact same system. Like the counterfactual, the really interesting to think about is, had NCLB not said that, which was in fact a political compromise the charter community had to make in 2001, 2002, had NCLB not said that charter schools have to be held accountable as other public schools, what would the world of pluralism look like?
Could they do more innovating over the ends, not just the means, and
Correct.
innovating over the measurement, not just, again, the ways to work towards the same performance goals?
A couple of important things. So one, this question about test score growth. So I happen to believe in measurement, and I feel like we've made a lot of progress, particularly in northeastern blue states where I don't get chastised for profanity, by building like schools that get amazing growth on test scores, particularly for low-income kids who are heavily clustered in highly democratic areas that are deeply localized. That I feel like our ability to make a case about charter expansion based on measurement at this point is just about tapped out. And if that is the political reality, right, and again, I'm a person who believes in this, then A, there's two things you should do, could do, I think we should be thinking about now. A, is this multiple definitions of measurement or whatever. In a way like as long as school ain't free, you need to measure, right? Like if it costs money, you got to be able to measure it. So that like at a minimum, we need to be able to know what we're buying for our kids, let alone what they're getting for the effort they put in.
Yep.
On the other side of this, though, I think it's just this question about constituency. So, give a shout out to people in Arizona. I was giving a shout out on this. Because, like, Arizona's a place that, like, a lot of the authorizing folk like to dog, and they went wild, wild west, and they opened a ton of schools, and they closed a bunch of them. But now, like, you have Great Hearts and Basis, and a whole bunch of schools that, like, middle-class, white families attend. And so charter schools are not under threat in Arizona, right? They're not under threat because they're large and diverse as a political constituency. And that is a product of multiple ways of figuring out what is good that are like probably weighted a little bit more toward choice than accountability, like the kids you don't want to hang out with. So this is like a complicated mix. I think it is particularly to suss out in places like the Northeast where the whole frame of this has been about closing gaps and like addressing deep inequities. But over time, like they still haven't gotten us the scale we need to make sure a kid in Central Harlem doesn't have to worry about his life-changing school being under attack. And I think we're going to deal with that now if we want to be able to answer these questions differently in 10 years.
Mm-hmm. That's well said. Agree. Just want to point out one thing about the arguments and the use of test scores and so forth, that one of the unfortunate consequences of a uniform school system as our default is that every other model has to justify itself in terms of superiority. And so, whose charter research do you trust? Are charter schools superior? Are they inferior? Well, they're both and, right? But the point is we are still within this cultural framework in which legitimacy rests upon superiority to the status quo. And I think that's a profoundly unhealthy way to have political debates. How much better, it may be necessary, it may have been necessary, but how much better to do what most democracies do, which is not compete between school sectors. They don't even investigate whether Jewish, Catholic, or state schools are superior. They rather focus on high quality across all schools. They look at an individual school and they look at multiple measures. So Ofsted, which inspects the schools in the UK, has 27 measures that they look at. And they take individual school cultures into account. They look at instruction and so forth. And the most important part, perhaps, is that this is very transparent. Schools that are funded, no matter what kind of school, have to publicize which curriculum they use. They have to talk about the mission that they follow. They have their Ofsted reports, public knowledge. Parents know what's going on. So that's a different way to get at this same question.
So we're going to open up to questions in just a minute, but before we do, I want to ask one more, which really is motivated by the fact that I think in the past several minutes, we've been talking a lot, to use Andy's spectrum that he laid out of the traditional governance model, charters in the middle, and then a more free market approach at the end. And I think, Andy, you suggested maybe introducing some more flexibility with respect to performance contracting in the middle might be a good place to end up. But I wonder if there's some who might be unsatisfied with that as sort of the ideal point or the implicit ideal point in the panel. And I can think of two reasons. One would be because when I heard Ashley talk about pluralism at the very start, above all, she emphasized religious diversity. And at least given how we've interpreted the US Constitution over time, religious diversity is not something that we can offer within the context of the charter sector. And I'm not optimistic, at least, about that interpretation changing. And so that might suggest that really to achieve true pluralism, we need to be talking about private school choice as well. A second reason might be because the charter model still, and a traditional voucher model, still talks about funding for a year's worth of tuition at a school, now the school of your choice, when really maybe what we need is innovation in that's much more radical than that, and that's the hopes of a lot of people who promote education savings accounts as a more flexible way of funding parental choice in education. So I wonder if any of you want to take up either of those sort of topics, the importance of religion in the conversation over pluralism, and maybe the potential advantages of more flexible funding mechanisms.
Go ahead.
I just want to take the first one as the least Catholic person in the universe who's a graduate of an Episcopalian high school. So there's no other sector where the government partners with the private or nonprofit civic universe where groups with religious affiliations are excluded. Soup kitchens, hospitals, you can make a list a mile long. The reasons why we choose in many places to not leverage the capital inherent in some of the oldest school systems in the world, right, is because the political incentives are aligned in a way that does not maximize that. And I just want to point out the truth of this. There is a person who never went to public school in his entire life, who also was the first black president of the United States. You cannot tell me that the non-public religious school sector cannot offer a benefit to this country, let alone any individual kid someplace. So far from being excluded from the solution, I think they are a vital and important part of how we actually get to the diversity of option and fit that we've been talking about so far.
So I'll hit the second, and to some degree, again, it comes down to measurement. I think the people in this room don't believe, and if we believed it, we couldn't sell it, that if a pluralistic approach ended up with the majority of students getting a worse education as measured by key kinds of things like college going and life success, that we would all feel good about the work we're doing. So in the end, performance matters, and it matters a lot. The question of test scores versus multiple measures is a MacGuffin. They're all short-term things that either translate into long-term outcomes or they don't. If they do, then great. If they don't, then why are we measuring them at all? The KIP has better test scores than the neighboring schools, and everybody kind of yawns, and well, that's great, but it doesn't really matter, and they must be prepping kids. They graduate, their middle school students graduate from college 4 times as often as the students in the schools around them. You talk to any parent with that number, and you have their attention. That can't be shrugged off. That matters. And when we start talking about things that matter, when we start measuring things that matter, a lot of this stuff goes away.
I'm just struck by the recent study that came out of Florida with respect to the charter schools, that charter school graduates in Florida, at least as far as the state universities, had higher attainment and also higher salaries. So workforce participation matters as well.
And that's an interesting case because Florida's charters had not been knocking it out of the park in terms of relative test score gains over the same period that study looked like. That's not always the case. We have sort of a mixed bag when it comes to the emerging evidence on the long-term effects of attending charter schools. And it's right, John, you alluded to this time lag earlier. It's very, I wish we could accelerate time so that we could get more evidence on these questions in the short run.
But I do think it's never not going to be a mixed bag. The question is the candy better?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you could get a mixed bag of stuff you don't want to eat. You want to get a mixed bag of things you do want to eat. Because running a school in the Pleistocene way is really hard, right? It is difficult to create the spark of excellence and to bring people together around that and to create communities that foster that. And we should just acknowledge that. Not everybody's going to be great at that. The question is, can more people be better at it? What should we do so that more people can have the opportunity to do it and so that the bag has more Snickers?
Say one thing, if I could just say one thing about the religious point, the religious point that you brought up earlier is that I don't think we can pretend that education is neutral in any event. I mean, if you omit talking about God, for example, you're still teaching children something. You're teaching children that those questions aren't important, for example. And so if you start with the premise that education is, that schools are meaning-making institutions, and that the questions we ask and what we teach and how the adults relate and all of those components of schooling, all of those elements are morally formative. If you start from that supposition, then the next step is, well, then we have to enable a variety of institutions.
Andy, I'm going to give you the last word on this conversation, but I'm going to remind people that we're about to start taking questions. There's a microphone right in the middle of this aisle here. Unfortunately, we only have one. So if you could make your way to that microphone and be ready. Andy?
Well, it'll be brief. And it's a lesson learned the hard way for me, and I think it's important as we think about the politics of this. So I honestly believed 10, 12, 15 years ago that once choice got started, it would have an energy of its own. And the logical conclusion was ultimately all families choosing a wide array of schools, add whatever to that, everyone's happy. It turned out that on the ground, that's actually not all that matters. Parent satisfaction or some of these mediating organizations, whatever kind of metrics we use. What we learned in New Orleans, what we're learning in Detroit, what we're learning in some of these other places, is even if there are really happy parents, test score gains, whatever kind of metrics you use, if the community feels like its system of public education is no longer the possession of the community, that community gets really upset. And so what happens in New Orleans after virtually 100% of kids are in independently run charter schools that are overseen by the state? There's virtually a rebellion among the political class in New Orleans, and they end up putting the charter schools back under the democratically elected school board. There's an effort in Detroit to create a sort of entity, a democratically elected entity that can oversee the charters. The point here is, I think we delude ourselves if we just think that all we got to do is satisfy the needs of individual families, which honestly, this is how I thought about the world for the past decade. It turns out that this enterprise of public education also has to include all of the voters, the people who are in the community, and if they feel like nonprofits or outsiders are running schools and educating their kids, and there's no way for democracy to control at least the contours of the shape of public education, they will do everything politically to get their control back. And we just have to put that into our calculus somehow.
Yes, ma'am. Please identify yourself.
I'm Carolyn Brown. I'm a state representative from Arkansas, and I fully support parents having the right to choose how their children and where their children are educated for whatever reason. Maybe it's close to where they work. Maybe it's a parochial school that supports their personal convictions. But I think one thing we have to face is public education today has many parents upset because of the cultural norms that are being inculcated into our children and the political norms. And having taught very briefly while I was working on my master's degree and being a student later in life, I was appalled at the political inculcation, brainwashing, if you have it, that's rampant in our textbooks. There's very selective material. Let's say you're discussing a concept, and then from a reading from the world, from some other author's book or the newspaper, they give an example that is so biased and so indicative of their political bias, that bias seems to be throughout that bias, that specific bias. So it becomes almost like a religious indoctrination, not totally an objective learning environment. And the idea about vouchers and private schools being funded with public dollars, I believe is sort of, that needs to be thought about differently. Parents should have the right to choose where their children are educated. Those dollars go to the child, not to the institution. And I think that might clear up some of the opposition to tax dollars going to a religious institution.
Thank you. I'm not sure I heard a question there, but Ashley, the comment
Wouldn't you agree?
The comment seems to be in your wheelhouse with respect to some of the implicit assumptions in the standards and curriculum.
Yeah, sure. So I agree with you that every element of a school is selected in some way, even if we have forgotten the original rationale. And being upfront about this means being able to say, for example, I'm a structural Marxist, and I want to send my child to a structural Marxist school. Or I'm Catholic, and I want to talk my child to be in a Catholic school. By the way, the Netherlands does have socialist schools. That was one of the reasons they passed these bills. Anyway, so...
Can I make one supporting point of this? I think so. You don't have to take the brunt of this
ahead.
one. So if you hung out with Dr. Berner, she always says, culture is all the decisions that were made before you got here. And I do think wrapped up in your quatement, like part question, part statement, is that there are very deliberate decisions that have been made that gave us like the default model of public education that we have today. And many of them were political, and many of them were meant to exclude one point of view or another. I mean, to make another example of this, all my TFA friends live and die by the fact that they can't find any textbooks that have heroes in them, protagonists in them that look like the kids that they teach. Like, that was an affirmative decision that somebody made along the way. So I just think it's really important, again, to realize that the systems are not neutral. They have a point of view.
They can't not.
And that will
They
apply
can't
to
not.
that will apply to whatever system
It
of
applies
standards,
to
however
whatever.
minimal, that Ashley wants to see
That's exactly
come
right.
out.
That's
And
exactly right. So, yeah.
You can do better or worse, but yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Doug Fauché. I'm from Houston. I serve on the KIP board. I also chair an organization called Houstonians for Great Public Schools. And I'm constantly challenged by this notion of choice as it relates to vouchers and or ESAs. And I can only speak for my state, but the notion of choice, I obviously agree with. I'm on the KIP board, but the problem in my state is that choice in the form of vouchers or ESAs has been sort of defined as you can opt out and you'll get $5,500 a year. So I asked the question, okay, if I'm a single mother in an underserved part of Houston, my kid's in a failing school, it's been a failing school forever, and I say, great, I now have choice. I take my $5,500 and exactly I do what? Because high-performing private schools in Houston, on average, cost 2x what public schools cost, and public schools are 2x the $5,500 that's being offered. So I could be a proponent for choice if choice was means-tested, and if after being means-tested, the amount of money given was actually enough for that parent to make a real choice. In the absence of that, what it looks like to me is a middle-class subsidy
Yep.
That's right.
to send their kids to good schools that are private. And I don't think that's the answer to the system, and I wonder if you would respond to that.
Just a quick observation. That's one of the reasons why I think our conversation started focusing on, well, what can we get out of the charter sector? Because there you do have the funding. It's not perfectly equitable, but you do have the level of funding to provide free
And
access.
it's also not means tested.
And it's not means tested. But I saw a number of people wanting to get in. John, you want to go first?
So here's why choice is hard. And I'm working with Walton Family Fund, desperate to find a state that wants to try to fix this. To do choice well, to build the kind of public awareness and enthusiasm for it that you need to solve your problem. First, you need better data, persuasive data, people looking at all sorts of longitudinal outcomes. By the way, you don't have to wait 30 years. You can measure middle school in part by how the kids do in high school. Do they drop out after the first year? How do they perform? And then from there. Second, so you're looking at longitudinal to the degree you can alongside shorter term metrics. Second, you give it to parents in a smart way that is around their kid, that doesn't just look at the data, but looks at it segmented. A student like yours will perform better here than there. And third is you connect that choice process with the actual selection. That now that you've looked at schools and you've said these three might be good, you click and you've applied. And that's true if they're independent schools, if they're religious schools, if they're district or charter schools. It's just you click and you've applied. If you can create a choice process that has good data, presents it well, and ties it to the selection, some of this stuff starts resolving itself. And we just need a state or two to step up and say, why don't we try that?
Do you mean it resolves itself in that it becomes easier to make the case for a higher level of funding?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. The more it all is one process, the more it feels to parents like they really do have a choice that's informed. I think the more public support there'll be, for instance, for rationalizing funding.
Yeah, can I build on this real quick? So I'm happy to be a great supporter of KIPP, Houston and everywhere. I think this is a fundamental failing of the efficiency leanings of our movement that came into existence 20 years ago. There is no reason why a kid should cross the street and be worth half as much, no matter what kind of school the kid goes to or whatever. And so in the beginning, particularly in the charter space, people were like, well, we can do more for less. What we should have been saying was we could do more for the same, because the number for the kid at KIPP is wrong too. So I do think this is an approach about, because you can't scale great private schools at $5,500. You can't do it, right? So I think we should just revisit the fact that in any district, like public district, in any state that's passed a weighted student formula, there's a base number that everybody's worth and you go up from there. And it's actually it's a fairer way to approach it, and we should look at charter funding and private school choice funding in a way that values a parent's ability to buy the same way.
Just one quick thought. I would expand this conversation beyond the funding level question. We got to keep in mind that the traditional system that we had in place had 100 years to figure stuff out. Related to funding and per pupil allotments and teacher certification and transportation and facilities and special education. It's not like they figured all this stuff out in year one. A century of effort went into doing this. I say this because chartering taught us the same thing. A lot of people believed a simple charter law, allow a nonprofit organization to petition the state for the right to run a public school. Full stop, everything's going to be hunky-dory. Well, it turns out that you got to figure out per pupil spending, and because you don't get a facility, where do you get the money for facilities? And can you access federal funds? Does that run through your district? What about transportation? It takes a long, long time to build a parallel system of education, given that you didn't have the 100 years of experience. And I think this whole sector of to the right of chartering, whether it's ESAs or tax credits or whatever else, we've got to give that sector some time to realize they got to figure all this stuff out too. So I would say, yes, the per pupil funding is an important issue, but until we figure out accountability, transportation, facilities, special education, equity, don't think this is going to be perfect. This is the technocrat in me speaking.
Could I just ask a follow-up question? Because I really, that's great. And how is it possible to think about the kinds of levels of funding that are being proposed in most states for ESAs and for vouchers, helping the people who need it the most? There is zero chance outside of Catholic schools who, don't pay the nuns, so they can do it at a lower cost. That's not scalable. There's zero chance that these kinds of funding levels in the city I am a part of, where we're 85% free and reduced lunch in the 7th largest school district in the country, none of those parents will be able to take advantage of this, what's being called as choice. Yet everyone who lives on the west side of town, who is middle class, will be able to use that $5,500 to make a choice that I would argue is not equitable relative to the whole. And guess what? Economies work. So what will happen to the price of private schools in our region? In 10 years, they'll go up by $5,500 a year. And the same people will be excluded from the system. And that, to me, is the elephant in the room that doesn't get talked about with regard to choice. So thank you.
So a couple things about this. It's a huge issue, and I think the first point is I agree with what everyone else on the panel has said about equitable funding, that when you have a voucher that is so far below the cost of tuition, then the low-income families can't take advantage of it. And we know this by studies. There's quite a bit of research that suggests this. A lot of these families cannot even borrow money. They don't have the capacity to borrow money to fill in the gap. So we do have to make sure that the funding is robust. But there's also ways, I think, of structuring legislation that makes it easier to scale up high-performing, low-cost schools. So when you look at the way the charter bills were created, they were predicated on the notion that we're going to be bringing new players into the system, whereas private school choice programs tend to be geared towards filling empty seats and stopgap measures for kids in failing schools. So to my knowledge, the Drexel Fund is one of the only entities in the country that's actually looking at this systematically. But how can you craft legislation that is that creates the certainty that new players have, that they can open a school that will be sustainable? So the funding levels, they have facilities funding, for example, or creating a bridge for accreditation so that before a school is actually accredited, it is overseen in ways to ensure quality and so forth. Because some programs unintentionally create barriers to entry. So there are things legislatively that can be done to improve the system.
Thank you.
Just one important skunk at the garden party addition to your series of Houston inquiries. I did not start working on school choice policy because I wanted to help middle-class people. When confronted politically by a bunch of middle and upper-class people from Princeton, I realized they had way more political power than the thousands of African-American and Hispanic moms whose kids went to schools you would never send somebody you love to in Newark, Patterson, Trenton, and Camden. And so I've been woke by the fact that white people with money have political power and currency, and that programs that exclude them are ones that are constantly under attack. And our programs exclude them broadly and are constantly under attack. And I think we got to figure out some way to reconcile this, because I'm not saying, oh, we need a $5,500 voucher program for rich people on the West Side. I'm saying a $5,500 voucher program for rich people on the West Side is not going to go away. So if that is the political truth, how do we make sure that all the other families who really need options, who need better supply, who need more choices at a better price point, get included in the public policy in a way that makes it stay and that grows support for it?
Well, certainly there's a difference between finding policy solutions that everyone benefits from and those that only benefit the advantage, right? And so I think that's the concern with the 5,500. Yes, sir.
I'm Dr. Richard Ziley, co-president of Michigan State Board of Education. Another elephant in the room that occurs to me is that schools are an extension of culture. And some people are oriented to that culture. They have the work ethic, they have the honesty, they have the mastery of the English language. And so they have a head start to begin with. Others have to be acculturated, maybe learn English as a second language, perhaps learn other habits or attitudes. Loyalty to one's peers is a great virtue, but it has to be set in, it has to be kind of set in a context so that when your friend is disciplined, you don't jump up and attack the teacher. Tolerance is a great virtue, and we're so successful that every kid in our high schools knows a drug dealer. So how do we come to grips with the fact that schools as an extension of culture is going to have a differential impact on people of different cultures? And a good example, I think, is the cultural Confucianism, which respects authority and hard work and self-sacrifice, which is why many Asians in America test above the national average. This is true in Malaysia as well. The Chinese minority gets all the scholarships and the professional positions as a function of cultural values. So when we talk about equity, how do we come to grips with the reality of differing cultural values? And a secondary problem is the contradictions within the contradictory messages within our culture. So we say, you know, we praise risk-taking, we say don't take a chance on drugs. Okay.
Anyone on the panel want to respond to that?
Okay, I'll step on that landmine. I'm not sure. No, step on it first. I didn't know you were going to go for it.
Go ahead.
I'm willing to take the shrapnel. I want to answer your question respectfully because there's a lot of tension in your question. I think there are two ways to deal with this. One is you want to give every kid who could have the unfortunate experience you were talking about the chance to have the right one. So I happen to be a poor kid who went to a very rich high school. I was the only black kid in my class for 3 years. I wouldn't trade it for anything, but it was hard as hell, right? It was not easy. I learned a lot there, and my life has been okay for it. There were a dozen kids on my block who had all the God-given potential in the world who did not have that outcome because they got the wrong fit for reasons of public policy. So I think you just got to talk about the fact that one way that you get kids who may not be acculturated the way you've described to become the people they can be is to let more people have a chance at it. Mm-hmm. The other one I would just say too is that, and I've written about the selective high school stuff in New York on this. So I actually have no problem with the fact that Stuyvesant is like 80% Asian. I have a problem with with black kids overwhelmingly going to schools that don't equip them to actually do well on the assessment, right? It's a more, it's a derivative thing that we shouldn't penalize kids who are actually playing by the rules. But that also said, those kids go to schools that don't really affirm their own identities, which I've come to think is something that's really important, in a way that builds the sort of behavior you're talking about. So like, what's it called, urban prep in Chicago, it's 100% all boys, all black, and everybody goes to college. And it's a wonderful college-going culture that, you know, is choice-driven and that affirms the identity, backgrounds, and futures of those kids. And there's not a lot of space for schools like that in our current definition of what excellence is, in our current sort of chartering ethos and that kind of thing. So I would take those two methods to your challenge and see what happens.
I would also add to that school culture matters. That when we look at research on what really narrows the achievement gap and what makes for long-term behavioral outcomes and success, the two factors that emerge again and again are a strong school culture and high-quality, rigorous academics. That when you provide those two things, you're changing the equation for students. And let me just focus for a minute on the school culture piece. A school culture is not just a friendly school. A positive school culture is not just a friendly school or a school where there are a few discipline problems. It's a school in which the norms are explicitly stated and play out through all the traditions of the school. So religious schools are quite easy with that if they're robust. Scott Sider's book on Character Compass looks at 3 different charter schools in Boston that have very different values, but those values are clear and the expectations are clear. That matters. It matters when a school can answer the why questions and when it has attracted staff that can answer the why questions in the same way. So that is, I think, one of the benefits of a pluralistic system. You are making it more likely that you will have a myriad of schools that have distinctive, robust, meaningful cultures.
That whatever the model is that they have, that they're doing it well.
That they're doing
that's
it
more
well.
important than which model you have in the first
Yeah,
place,
so
at least within a range.
Within a range, right. There are some normative school cultures that we should not support. And I'm happy to talk about that if anyone wants to.
I mean, that is sort of one, really, it's the dog that hasn't barked in this conversation, which is everyone loves the heck out of pluralism when it allows them to do what they like. But we all get really nervous when pluralism is going to allow people to do stuff that we don't like. There just needs to be room in this conversation saying that pluralism is awesome because it's empowering and allows culture and history to be passed on to people and allows families to have self-determination, communities to have self-determination. But I learned the hard way in a couple different previous jobs that there are lots of people who don't think that those other people are doing their schools right, and they love pluralism when it enabled them to do their schools their own way.
So we're almost at time, but we have 3 or 4 minutes left. And I started out the session by noting that the session title had a question mark at the end, the future of American education. So I want to give each of you a chance to reflect just very briefly on that question. Is pluralism the future of American education? And if the answer is it depends, what does it depend on? Where are we headed? Ashley, you want to go first?
I hope so. I think we're headed in that direction. I think the risks to pluralism are from both sides. On the one hand, the pull of the status quo is very strong. And on the other hand, the libertarian impulse that education's a private good is very strong as well. So if we can chart that middle path in which we have strong school cultures and some form of assurance of quality and continue at it, yes, I'm optimistic.
So I agree with what Ashley said. 2 quick points. One, I would say that counterintuitively, education is a good that masquerades as a right because it's bought and sold through the housing market. So it's like a key and difficult distinction. And I would also say, again, counterintuitively, we actually have a pluralistic system now. It's just pluralism of location. Yep. So, and your ability to navigate location is what gets you the kind of system you want. And that is a highly exclusive and divisive system that actually continues to push gains to the top. And it actually isn't diverse, right? It's just different by place in a way that evinces lots of different values that people want, and hold dear.
I think it is, but to get there involves a lot of blocking and tackling. And the ways we measure and the ways we empower parents to make choice with good information and good systems are a prerequisite to any kind of pluralistic outcome that is durable and survives the kind of attacks that are inevitable.
I think that if you take the long view of American history, that pluralism is the norm. It just looks different, and then there are these sort of ups and downs. So before we were even a country, on these shores were very different schools. Catholics set up schools here well before the Declaration of Independence. I mean, there was Harvard. There were institutions of higher education that had different faith traditions. As the time progressed and we got to the common schools movement, there was this understanding that we needed common schools for everybody. But because we had such small school districts, literally 1 school districts or 2 school districts, that was still a way of having pluralism because people like-minded live close to one another. And so that continued for quite some time. Remember, there was a time not all that century ago when there were 100,000 school districts in America. Very small democratic units that reflected the needs of small communities. That is pluralism in my book. It's only when we started expanding districts, and they got bigger and bigger and bigger, and each family's vote in that system got smaller, meaning it was less pluralistic, that we then started seeing other ways of people realizing pluralism. It is no coincidence that we saw an explosion of Catholic schools from the turn of the 20th century to 1965, when more than 5 million kids were in those schools. And it's no coincidence that starting in 1990, we had the charter movement and the choice movement. What I'm trying to say is there's always a sort of tension, but America's families always want to have agency, always want to have different options available to them. So I don't think we're doing something different now. I just think we're living a different chapter of an ongoing story.
Well, as I said at the outset, I warned you that we would likely hear 4 yeses to the question, is and should the future of American education be more pluralistic than it is now? But I hope you'll agree with me that there was still a lot of interesting conversation and insight along the way. And join me in thanking the panelists.
Thanks, everyone.